This episode of the Random Michigander contains extensive references to gruesome crimes and graphic content, thus, listener discretion is advised. On today's episode, we'll be talking about a series of crimes in the late 1960s that occurred in southeast Michigan that later became known as the Michigan Murders.
Take a trip with me, baby, let's meander. Going through so many Great Lake standards. See the sights, highlights of Barry Sanders. Come along with the Random Michigander. Come along with the Random Michigander.
Alright everyone, welcome to the Random Michigander. I am your host, Brandon Griffiths. I'll be providing a regular dose of Great Lakes state-related topics in podcast form, from history and events to locations, popular culture and sports, as well as food and drinks and basically anything else that might help you learn more about the great U.S. state of Michigan. For those that don't know, the Michigan Murders were a series of highly publicized killings of young women committed between 1967 and 1969 in the Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti area of southeastern Michigan by an individual known as the Ypsilanti Ripper, the Michigan Murderer, and the co-ed killer. The first known victim linked to the Michigan Murderer was a 19-year-old Eastern Michigan University accounting student named Mary Therese Flazar, who was last seen by a neighbor walking toward her Ypsilanti apartment on the evening of July 9, 1967. This neighbor twice observed a young man in a blue-gray Chevrolet slow to a halt beside Flazar and begin talking to her. Each time, Flazar had shaken her head and walked away from the car. Her nude body was found by two 15-year-old boys on an abandoned farm in Superior Township on August 7th and was formally identified via dental records the following day. The corpse was badly decomposed, although the pathologist who examined Flazar's remains was able to determine she had been stabbed approximately 30 times in the chest and abdomen with a knife or other sharp object, that her feet had been severed just above the ankle, the thumb and sections of the fingers of one hand were missing, and that one forearm had been severed from her body. These severed appendages were never found. Despite the advanced state of decomposition, the pathologist was also able to locate multiple lineal abrasions upon the victim's chest and torso, indicating that Flazar had been extensively beaten before her death. Although police theorized that Flazar had been raped, the advanced state of decomposition of the corpse had erased any conclusive evidence of sexual assault. A detailed examination of the crime scene revealed that the body had been moved 3 times throughout the month before it was found. Initially, the body was left resting upon a pile of bottles and cans, obscured from view by elder trees, before being dragged 5 feet from this location into a field where it had remained exposed throughout much of the time until it was discovered. Shortly before the body was located, the murderer had again returned to the body, which he had moved an additional 3 feet. 2 days after the remains had been identified as those of Mary Flazar, a young man claiming to be a friend of the Flazar family arrived at the funeral home holding Flazar's body prior to her scheduled burial. This individual had asked for permission to take a photograph of the body as it lay in the coffin as a keepsake for her parents. When informed that this request was impossible, the young man had replied, "You mean you can't fix her up enough so I could just get one picture of her?" Sternly informed a second time he would not be allowed to view the body, the young man had wordlessly exited the funeral home. The receptionist could not offer any clear description of the man beyond that he was a handsome young white male with dark hair, that he had driven a blue-gray Chevrolet, and that he had not been carrying a camera. Almost 1 year later, on July 5, 1968, the partially decomposed, mutilated body of a 20-year-old art student named Joan Elspeth Schell was found by construction workers on an Ann Arbor roadside. She had been raped, then stabbed 25 times with a knife estimated to have measured 4 inches in length. Several of these wounds had punctured her lungs, liver, and carotid artery, with one additional wound inflicted behind her left ear, fracturing her skull. In addition, her throat had been slashed, and her miniskirt then tied around her neck. Although Shell had been dead for several days, her entire lower body was in remarkably preserved condition, whereas her head, shoulders, and breasts were in an advanced state of decomposition, leading the pathologist to conclude her body had been stored in a naturally cool environment, but with the upper third of her body exposed to natural heat. The lack of blood beneath or near the corpse, plus the testimony of eyewitnesses, led investigators to determine Shell's body had lain in its present location for less than 24 hours. Her murderer had likely driven to the location to dispose of her body before making rudimentary efforts to conceal the body with clumps of grass. In addition, the outstanding similarities between the wounds inflicted upon her body and those inflicted upon Flazar the previous year led investigators to establish a definite connection between both murders, and 4 detectives were assigned to work full time on both cases. Shell hailed from Plymouth and had recently moved into a house on Emmett Street in Ypsilanti. She was last seen by her roommate, Susan Colby, at a Washtenaw Avenue bus stop on the evening of June 30th. Shell had intended to travel to Ann Arbor to visit her boyfriend, and her roommate had accompanied her to the bus stop. Colby later informed investigators that Shell had informed her of her intentions to hitchhike when it became apparent that she had missed the last bus, and that one of the first vehicles to pass when Shell had begun hitchhiking was a red and black Pontiac Bonneville containing 3 young white men. This vehicle had slowed to a stop before the driver had asked her, "Want a ride?" The driver had been aged around 20 and clean cut with short, dark, side parted hair. Colby later stated she had attempted to dissuade Shell from entering this vehicle, but that Shell had opted to accept the driver's offer, promising to call her roommate to assure her of her safety once she reached her boyfriend's Ann Arbor residence. Less than 3 hours later, Colby reported her roommate missing after failing to receive any contact from her. Despite tracing and eliminating more than 150 registered owners of red and black vehicles in the state of Michigan, and establishing the alibis of numerous individuals whose physical features bore a likeness to the composite drawing of the driver the police had obtained from Colby, all investigative lines of inquiry into the murder of Joan Shell failed to bear fruit. On August 18th, investigators announced that all significant leads had been exhausted and that the number of officers assigned to investigate the case had been reduced. Nonetheless, the inquiry into both murders remained active, and a reward then totaling $7,800, equivalent to approximately $70,500 today, for information leading to the conviction of the perpetrator of both homicides remained. 2 months after Shell's murder, police inquiries produced 2 further eyewitnesses who stated that they had observed Shell walking with a young man along Emmett Street on the evening she disappeared. Although neither eyewitness was certain, both believed this student to be John Norman Collins, a student at Eastern Michigan University majoring in elementary education, who lived directly across the street from Shell at 619 Emmett, and whose physical features bore a likeness to the composite drawing police had generated of the driver of the vehicle Shell had entered. Questioned by police, Collins flatly denied even knowing Shell and insisted he had spent the weekend of June 29th through the 30th with his mother at her house in the Detroit suburb of Centerline and had not returned to Ypsilanti until the morning of July 1st. Initially, police took him at his word and did not seek to verify his alibi. Great work, guys. On March 20th, 1969, a 23-year-old University of Michigan law student named Jane Louise Mixer disappeared after posting a note on a college bulletin board seeking a lift across the state to her hometown of Muskegon, where she had intended to inform her family of her engagement and imminent move to New York City. Her fully clothed body, covered with her own raincoat, and with a copy of the novel Catch-22 placed by her side, was found the following morning atop a grave in Denton Cemetery in Van Buren Township. An autopsy revealed Mixer had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber pistol, then garroted with a nylon stocking which the pathologist noted had not belonged to her. The pathologist also stated that Mixer had not been sexually assaulted, that death had occurred at approximately 3 a.m. on March 21st and that she had not been killed at the location where her body had been discovered. Despite the lack of evidence of a sexual assault, the fact that Mixer's pantyhose had been pulled down to expose her thighs and sanitary napkins suggested a sexual motive behind the murder. Although she had not been beaten, stabbed, or mutilated, her student status, the tying of a garment around her neck, and the proximity of her abduction and murder led investigators to tentatively link her murder to those of Flazar and Shell. 4 days after the discovery of Mixer's body, on March 25th, a surveyor discovered the nude, mutilated body of a teenage girl lying upon a blue jacket behind a vacant house on a remote, rural section of Earhart Road, just a few hundred yards from where the body of Joan Shell had been discovered 8 months previously. Investigators called to the crime scene noted a dramatic increase in the savagery exhibited against the victim, with one investigator describing the injuries inflicted upon the victim as being the worst he had seen in 30 years of police work. A subsequent autopsy revealed the victim had died of numerous fractures covering 1/3 of her skull and one side of her face, all of which had been inflicted with a heavy blunt instrument. These injuries had been inflicted after the victim had been extensively beaten and tortured. Her killer had placed a section of her own shirt into her trachea to muffle her screams as she received extensive blunt force trauma to the face, head, and body, including several deep lacerations believed to have been inflicted with a leather strap. Welt marks upon the chest and shoulders indicated the killer had also used restraints to hold the victim prone as he whipped her torso and upper legs with a leather belt, before tearing a branch from a nearby tree and inserting this instrument 8 inches into her vagina. Blood spatterings and churned soil close to the crime scene indicated she had been beaten close to where her body was discovered and that she may have attempted to escape her attacker. The victim was identified as 16-year-old Romulus High School student Mara Lynn Skelton, who had disappeared while hitchhiking in Ann Arbor. She was last seen alive outside a drive-in restaurant on Washtenaw Avenue 2 days before her body was discovered, although autopsy reports indicated Skelton had died between 24 and 36 hours before her body was discovered. Investigators noted strong similarities between this murder and previous killings attributed to the Michigan murderer, including the fact that a garter belt had been tied around Skelton's neck and her clothes and shoes had been neatly placed beside her body. However, the dramatic increase in savagery exhibited against the victim and the fact that Skelton was a known drug user, dealer, and occasional police informant, as opposed to a university student, led some junior investigators to speculate her murder may have been drug-related. Nonetheless, Ann Arbor Police Chief Walter Krasny formally linked Skelton's murder to the series. Following the March 24th murder of Marlon Skelton, police from the 5 separate jurisdictions where the murderer had abducted or disposed of the bodies of his victims formally combined resources in an effort to compare information and identify the perpetrator. Although investigators had informally exchanged information with agencies from other jurisdictions on an irregular basis since the previous summer, no coordination to combine efforts and resources had ensued until the discovery of the 3rd victim definitively linked to the series. By early April, each of these law enforcement agencies had collectively assigned 20 investigators to work exclusively upon the 4 homicides. Very little physical evidence existed beyond eyewitness descriptions and forensic reports. Police had noted and would continue to note common denominators in the physical characteristics of the victims and the manner in which they died. All of the victims had been brunette Caucasians. Each, excluding Mixer, had been the recipient of extensive violence inflicted with a blunt and/or bladed instrument prior to her murder. Each of the victims' bodies had been found within a 15-mile radius of Washtenaw County, and each victim, excluding Mixer, had received knife wounds to the neck. Furthermore, each victim had been found with an item of clothing tied around her neck, and each woman had been menstruating at the time of her death. These factors led police to publicly conclude the same perpetrator was responsible for at least 3 of the murders thus far committed. At 6:30 a.m. on April 16th, the body of a 13-year-old schoolgirl named Dawn Louise Basum was found beside a desolate road in Ypsilanti, clothed only in a white blouse and bra, which had been pushed around her neck. She had been repeatedly stabbed in the chest and genitals, had received multiple slash wounds across her breasts, buttocks, and stomach, then strangled to death with a 2-foot length electrical flex still knotted around her neck. A handkerchief found stuffed in her mouth had likely been placed there to muffle her cries throughout the torture, and her murderer had placed her body in a location where rapid discovery was assured. Investigators found no definite evidence Basem had been subjected to a sexual assault prior to her murder. Basem had last been seen alive at 7:30 p.m. the previous evening, walking home from a friend's house located barely a mile from her own home. She had been accompanied part of the way by a friend named Earl Kidd, who informed police he and Basem had parted company at a desolate road just 5 blocks from her home, where Basem had begun walking alone alongside railroad tracks toward her house. One eyewitness reported seeing the girl minutes thereafter at approximately 7:35, although her movements after that were never verified. The orange mohair sweater belonging to Basem was found in a deserted farmhouse just 100 yards from the desolate road on which her body had been placed after she was murdered. Glass particles found within the farmhouse's basement were of a similar consistency to those found upon the soles of Basem's shoes. Upon conducting a further search of the basement, investigators discovered an additional garment of her clothing, a length of electrical flex of the same type used to strangle the victim, and fresh human blood stains indicating this location as being the site of Basem's murder. 1 week after the murder of Dawn Basem, a detective conducting a routine examination of the farmhouse basement discovered a scrap of cloth from Basem's blouse, plus an earring later determined to belong to Mara Lynn Skelton. Each item had been deliberately placed in this location, indicating that the murderer had returned to the scene of the crime and that the two homicides were definitely linked. The farmhouse itself was destroyed in an act of arson on May 13th, and when the fire was extinguished, 5 clipped lilac blossoms were found arranged in an even row across the driveway to the building, leading investigators to theorize that they had been placed there by the murderer that symbolize each victim. Less than 2 months after the murder of Dawn Basem, on June 9th, 3 teenage boys discovered a partially nude body of a young woman in a field close to an abandoned farmhouse on North Territorial Road. The victim had received multiple slash and stab wounds to the body, including 2 stab wounds which had pierced her heart, and a gunshot wound to the forehead before her neck had been cut through to the spine. The victim's right thumb had also received a gunshot wound, suggesting the woman had instinctively raised her hand to protect herself before her killer had fired the gun at point-blank range. She had also been raped, although the pathologist was unable to determine whether this act had occurred before or after her death. Sections of her clothing were scattered around her body, although one of her shoes was missing. The victim was identified the following day as a 21-year-old University of Michigan graduate student named Alice Elizabeth Colomb, who had disappeared shortly after midnight on the morning of June 8th. She was last seen walking home toward her apartment on Thompson Street, having attended a friend's party. The discovery of several dried bloodstains and 2 buttons missing from the victim's raincoat at a Northfield Township commercial gravel pit on June 10th indicated the victim had been murdered at this location. Investigators had publicly claimed prior to Colomb's murder they were satisfied that the third victim, initially linked to the Michigan murderer, Jane Mixer, had been killed by a separate perpetrator. The fact Colomb had also received a gunshot wound to the head led investigators to reconsider the possibility Mixer may have been murdered by the same perpetrator. By the spring of 1969, public outcry regarding the murders committed by the individual dubbed by the press as the Michigan murderer and the co-ed killer was increasing, particularly among the student population of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. The increase in frequency in which the killer was striking throughout the spring and summer of 1969, coupled with the fact most victims had been connected to the University of Michigan or Eastern Michigan University, suggested the killer may be a fellow student, further compounded the concerns of female students. Many female students opted to arm themselves with knives, with others adopting a buddy system whereby they would refuse to walk anywhere unless in the company of a trusted male friend or at least 3 other girls. Sales of tear gas, knives, and security locks increased. Hitchhiking became a rarity among students, and the reward offered for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the murderer increased to $42,000, which would be about $360,000 today. By July of 1969, as a result of the coordinated investigation into the killings More than 1,000 convicted sex offenders had been investigated and eliminated as suspects. Over 800 tips from informants had been actively investigated, and several thousand individuals had been routinely interviewed. Although Washtenaw County Sheriff Douglas Harvey conceded at a press conference that same month that investigators had very little physical evidence to act upon and that the perpetrator had yet to make a serious error, he was adamant about the fact that the murderer was still at large due to pure luck and not for lack of police effort. At the request of an Ann Arbor citizens community, a Dutch psychic named Peter Herkos traveled to Washtenaw County on July 21st to generate a psychic profile of the murderer. Herkos accurately predicted that the murderer was a strongly built white male under 25 years of age who had been born outside the United States and who rode a motorcycle. In addition to having led investigators to the precise location where each of the victims' bodies had been found, Herkos also revealed details of the murders to investigators which had not been released to the press. Although this information proved to be of little help throughout the actual manhunt, Herkos also predicted that this individual would soon strike one final time. The final murder attributed to the killer was that of 18-year-old Karen Sue Beinman, an Eastern Michigan University student who was last seen alive on July 23, 1969. She was reported missing by her roommate, Sherry Green, when she failed to return to her dormitory after curfew. Upon questioning both of Beinman's roommates, police were informed that Beinman had been last seen shortly after noon on her way to a downtown wig shop. 3 days after the disappearance of Beinman, her nude body was discovered face down in a wooded gully alongside the Huron River Parkway. A medical examination revealed Beinman had been extensively beaten about the face and body, with some lacerations inflicted being so severe sections of skin had been removed, exposing subcutaneous tissues. She had received extensive skull and brain injuries, which had been inflicted with a blunt instrument, had been forced to ingest a caustic substance, and her neck, shoulders, nipples, and breasts had been burned with the same caustic agent. As had been the case with previous victims, her killer placed a section of cloth in her throat to muffle her screams throughout her torture. It was determined that Beinman had died of strangulation, although the pathologist noted the blunt force injuries inflicted to her skull and brain had been so extensive they would have likely proven fatal. The forensic examination of Beinman's body further revealed she had been raped prior to her murder and that her torn panties had been forcefully placed inside her vagina. These panties revealed the presence of human semen and human hair clippings measuring less than 3/8 of an inch. These hair clippings were predominantly blonde and as such did not belong to the victim, whose own hair color had been dark brown. Mindful of the fact the killer had evidently returned to the sites of his previous murders to move the bodies, possibly in a sexual ritual, police theorized he may also attempt to return to this latest crime scene. Although earlier attempts to enforce news blackouts as to the discovery of Bazum and Colomb had proven unsuccessful, on this occasion, police successfully ordered a news blackout related to the discovery of this latest victim. Feynman's body was replaced with that of a tailor's mannequin, and the gullies surrounding this mannequin monitored by undercover officers. At approximately 12:15 a.m. the following morning, in the midst of a heavy, humid storm, one officer observed a young man running from the gully. The heavy rain and insect irritation had prevented the officer from observing the young man actually approaching the gully. Although this officer attempted to radio this sighting to his colleagues, the rain had rendered his radio inoperable. Upon retracing Beinman's movements on the day of her disappearance, police questioned the proprietor of the wig shop Beinman had visited immediately prior to her disappearance, Diana Joan Ghosh. Ghosh recalled Beinman visiting her store to purchase a $20 headpiece in the early afternoon of July 23rd. She also recalled having observed a young man with short, side-parted dark hair wearing a horizontal striped sweater waiting on a blue motorcycle outside the shop as Beinman had made her purchase. Reportedly, Beinman herself insisted Ghosh observe the man with whom she had accepted a ride, stating that she had made two foolish errors in her life, purchasing a wig and accepting a ride from a stranger. She then stated, "I've got to be either the bravest or the dumbest girl alive because I've just accepted a ride from this guy." Ghosh then observed Beinman climb onto the motorcycle before the young man with whom she had accepted the ride drove away. Although Ghosh would initially and incorrectly describe the motorcycle as being possibly a Honda 350 model, when the police questioned Carol Wyzersa, who was a clerk in the store adjacent to the wig shop. Wyzersa was able to state that the model of the motorcycle was actually a Triumph. The description of the young man with whom Bindman had last been seen alive was heard by a patrolman named Larry Mathewson, who believed the person described by Diana Ghosh and others may be John Norman Collins, a former Theta Chi fraternity brother of his who had previously been interviewed but eliminated from police inquiries, and whom Mathewson had himself seen riding his motorcycle around the Eastern Michigan University campus on the afternoon of July 23rd. When Mathewson questioned Collins on July 25th as to his movements 2 days prior, he admitted that on the date in question, he had been riding his Triumph Bonneville in the vicinity and that he had stopped to converse with a former girlfriend of his while doing so, point at which Mathewson had observed him. This former girlfriend was able to provide Mathewson with 2 recent photographs of Collins. When Mathewson showed these photographs to both Ghosh and her assistant, Patricia Spaulding, both women were adamant the man in the photographs was the same individual with whom Bindman had last been seen alive. Police had already established that Collins was a known motorcycle enthusiast who owned several motorcycles, including a blue Triumph Bonneville. He held a part-time job as an inspector at a firm which manufactured drum brakes and was currently majoring in elementary education at Eastern Michigan University. Prior to enrolling at Eastern Michigan University in the fall of 1966, he had been an honor student and football co-captain at his high school. Collins had established a reputation among his peers at Eastern Michigan University as a habitual thief who had once been evicted from a fraternity for stealing from his roommates. Some acquaintances noted Collins's politeness around women, while others described him as lascivious and bad-tempered. He was known to engage in sexual violence, including one instance in which he had raped a woman who had resisted his advances. Moreover, several of these female acquaintances divulged that Collins would become enraged upon learning a woman was menstruating. One woman revealed to police that on one occasion, when Collins had begun groping her breasts, she had informed him she was experiencing her period. In response, Collins had yelled, "That is really disgusting," before angrily walking out of her apartment. Upon questioning Collins's co-workers, investigators learned that Collins had repeatedly taken delight in describing in graphic detail the extent of the injuries inflicted upon each successive victim linked to the Michigan murderer to his female colleagues. He had claimed these details had been provided to him by an uncle of his named David Leake, who served as a sergeant in the police force. The injuries described by Collins were consistent with those inflicted upon the victims, which had not been disclosed to the news media, and David Leake would inform investigators that he had not disclosed any information regarding the Michigan murders to his nephew. Investigators also ascertained Collins had either been acquainted with most of the victims, had currently or previously lived close to their place of residence, or had likely established possible contact prior to their murders. In the case of the victims Mary Flazar and Joan Shell, investigators were able to establish he had been a neighbor of both women, and that at the time of Flazar's disappearance, Collins had actually worked in an office at Eastern Michigan University located directly opposite the hallway from the office where Flazar herself had worked. Through interviewing a recent girlfriend of Collins, investigators also learned that he had lived in an apartment complex directly across the road from the home of Dawn Basum, and that throughout their courtship, Collins had been a regular visitor to her apartment. As such, he may have become acquainted with Basum throughout the time that he frequented his girlfriend there. Following her identification of a photograph of Collins, police further questioned Diana Ghosh, the proprietor of the wig shop in which Bindman had last been seen alive, asking her to identify the man she had seen with Bindman in a police lineup. In this lineup, Ghosh positively identified the man she had seen with Karen Sue Bindman as John Norman Collins. In total, 7 witnesses would be found who would later testify to having seen Collins in the area between the university campus and Mrs. Ghosh's wig shop between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on July 23rd, including 3 young women who had stated Collins had attempted to entice them onto his motorcycle. On Sunday, July 27th, police arrived at the apartment on Emmett Street that Collins shared with his roommate, Arnold Davis. Although Collins emphatically proclaimed his innocence and insisted the eyewitnesses' identification of him had been an error, He refused to return to the police station to take a polygraph test. The following evening, Davis observed Collins emerging from his bedroom carrying a box partially covered by a blanket. As Davis opened the door for his roommate to leave the apartment, he observed that the contents of this box included a woman's purple shoe, rolled up jean like material, and a burlap purse. Later that evening, Collins informed Davis that he had simply decided to get rid of the box and its contents. Collins's uncle, State Police Sergeant David Leake, had been on vacation with his family at the time of Bindman's disappearance and had only returned home on July 29th, which was 3 days after the discovery of her body. Throughout their vacation, Collins had been temporarily residing in the Leake family's Ypsilanti home, having been granted sole access to the house so that Collins could feed their German Shepherd while the family was away. Upon their return from their vacation, Leake's wife Sandra had noted numerous paint marks covering the floor of the family basement, and that several items, including a bottle of ammonia, a box of laundry detergent, and a canister of black spray paint, were missing from the household. That same day, Leake was advised by investigators of his nephew's status as a suspect in the case and the level of circumstantial evidence unfolding against him. Leake acknowledged that the evidence thus far gathered against his nephew was compelling, although initially he did not advise officers of the items missing from his household or the paint marks he and his wife had found upon the floor of their basement. However, the following morning, Leake scraped away some of the black paint which had been sprayed in his basement to reveal a stain which looked ominously like human blood and immediately returned to the police station to report his findings. The basement of Sergeant Leake's home was subjected to an intense forensic examination, although forensic experts would deduce later that morning that the stains covered by the black paint had actually been varnish stains. One of the investigators discovered numerous hair clippings, many measuring less than 3/8 of an inch, beside the family washing machine. When questioned as to the source of these clippings, Leake, who had not been informed of the discovery of the hair clippings found upon Bindman's panties, informed investigators that his wife regularly cut their children's hair in this basement and that she had done so shortly before the family had embarked upon their vacation. Moreover, this search had also uncovered small blood stains in 9 areas of the basement. 2 of these bloodstains were discovered to be type A, which was the blood type of Karen Sue Bindman. The hairs found upon Bindman's panties and those recovered from the basement of the Leake home were subjected to a detailed forensic neutron analysis to determine whether they had sourced from the same individuals. Samples recovered from both locations would prove to be a precise match. Evidently, despite Collins's protestations of innocence and denials of even knowing Karen Sue Bindman, she had been in the basement of Collins's uncle at the time of, shortly before, and shortly after her murder. Subsequent questioning of Leake's neighbors yielded additional circumstantial evidence. One neighbor, Marjorie Barnes, recalled having witnessed Collins leaving his uncle's home with a deluxe laundry detergent box prior to the Leake family returning from their vacation. Another neighbor informed investigators she had heard the muffled screams of a young female emanating from the Leake household on the evening of Bindman's disappearance. On the same afternoon police searched the Leake family's basement, Collins was confronted with evidence thus far gained and deduced. Although Collins burst into tears when informed the stains on the floor covered with paint had been varnish, he quickly regained his composure and continued to deny any knowledge of Karen Sue Bindman. Later that day, having received initial laboratory reports indicating the hair samples recovered from Bindman's panties matched those discovered in the Leake's basement, and that the bloodstains recovered from this location were of the same type as hers, Collins was arrested and his apartment and vehicles thoroughly searched. Despite recovering numerous stolen items from his apartment and being informed by his roommate, Arnold Davis, that Collins had been in the habit of committing burglaries with a former roommate of theirs named Andrew Manuel, no incriminating evidence linking Collins to Bindman or any victim of the Michigan murders was discovered, although officers were informed by Arnold Davis on this date of the incident 2 days earlier in which Davis had observed Collins carrying a laundry box containing women's clothing and jewelry from his apartment toward his car. On August 1st, 1969, John Norman Collins was formally arraigned for the murder of Karen Sue Bindman. He was held without bond. At a press conference relating to the arrest and charge of Collins in relation to the last of the Michigan murders held on this date, Police Superintendent Frederick Davids revealed that Collins had been a suspect in the Bindman case from the very day she had disappeared, and that these suspicions had heightened following their forensic examination of David Leake's basement. Furthermore, surveillance of Collins had been initiated on July 26th following the submission of a report compiled by patrolman Larry Mathewson detailing the positive eyewitness identification he had obtained, and he had been formally arrested upon an open charge on the evening prior to his arraignment. In early August, investigators were contacted by their counterparts in Salinas, California, who stated they had reason to believe a Michigan individual named John may be responsible for the June 30th death of a 17-year-old girl named Roxy Ann Phillips. On August 3rd, two Washtenaw County detectives traveled to Salinas Police Department to review information and determine whether a connection existed between Phillips's murder and those which Collins was suspected of committing in Michigan. Reviewing information regarding the murder of Roxy Ann Phillips, investigators discovered that immediately prior to her disappearance, Phillips had informed a close friend that she had become acquainted with an Eastern Michigan University student named John, who drove a silver gray Oldsmobile Cutlass and who was temporarily residing with a friend in a camper trailer. Upon tracing Collins's movements in relation to the dates of the disappearance and murder of the 7 victims linked to the Michigan murderer, which then included Jane Mixer, police discovered that on June 21st, Collins and his roommate Andrew Manuel had traveled to Monterey in Collins's Oldsmobile Cutlass, which the pair used to tow a camper trailer they had rented under false names and had paid for with a stolen check for the vacation. Collins had later returned to Michigan alone in his vehicle. Manuel would later be located in Arizona following Collins's arrest. Through interviewing acquaintances of Phillips, investigators established that she had been introduced to the individual she had referred to as John from Michigan through a 17-year-old friend named Nancy Ann Albrecht, who informed police she had herself become acquainted with Collins on June 29th and that she had mentioned her friend, Phillips, to Collins on this date. Albrecht described this individual, whose surname she did not know, as being 5 foot 11 inches tall, clean cut, with dark brown hair, and who had described himself as an Eastern Michigan University senior with aspirations to become a teacher. Albrecht had provided Monterey County investigators with an identikit which, in addition to her descriptions of the suspect's possessions, circumstances, and status, bore a striking resemblance to John Norman Collins. She had made arrangements to meet Collins at her home on the evening of June 30th, but Collins had never arrived. Phillips's nude, battered body had been found in a ravine in Carmel Highlands on July 13th, with the belt belonging to her culotte dress knotted around her neck. She had been strangled to death and, as with several Michigan victims linked to Collins, one earring was missing. Several of Phillips's personal possessions would later be found strewn along State Route 68. A rented trailer in which Collins and Manuel had traveled to California was located on August 1st in Monterey County, behind the home of Andrew Manuel's grandfather. A forensic examination of this trailer revealed it had been completely wiped of fingerprints. Upon questioning Manuel's grandfather, investigators were informed that his grandson and one John Collins had temporarily resided in the trailer, which they had hired from an Ypsilanti rental firm between June and July, before both men had abandoned the trailer, after which the grandfather believed they had returned to Michigan. Having compared case notes, investigators in both California and Michigan agreed enough similarities existed between the murder of Roxy Ann Phillips and the Michigan murders to establish a definite connection between the cases. And on August 5th, this connection was formally announced. An FBI arrest warrant was issued against Andrew Manuel, who was located in Phoenix on August 6th and detained by FBI agents. Manuel was extensively questioned as to his potential involvement in both Phillips's murder and those committed in Michigan, which investigators had linked to Collins, and agreed to submit to a polygraph test. No hard evidence would ever arise suggesting his involvement in any of the murders, and the Washtenaw County Prosecutor's Office would publicly announce on December 18th their satisfaction that Manuel had no knowledge of the murders. A formal indictment would later be served against Collins for the first-degree murder of Roxy Ann Phillips in April of 1970, although the evidence surrounding this indictment was ordered to be sealed until after the trial of Collins for the murder of Karen Sue Bindman had concluded. On August 14th, 1969, Collins attended a pretrial hearing at Ypsilanti District Court. After hearing 6 hours of testimony from 9 prosecution witnesses, Judge Edward Deek ruled that probable cause had been established and Collins was formally ordered to stand trial for Bindman's murder. At a second hearing in September, Collins refused to enter a plea. Washtenaw County Circuit Court Judge John Conlin ordered a plea of not guilty be entered on his behalf. At this hearing, Collins's court-appointed attorney, Richard Ryan, challenged the validity of the physical evidence and the credibility of the circumstantial evidence before formally requesting the case against his client be dismissed and the evidence seized from his rooming house and his vehicle suppressed upon the grounds that Collins had not consented to a police search of his property. Ryan further stated at this hearing he was undecided as to whether the upcoming trial be held away from the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti district due to pretrial publicity, and this final motion was held in abeyance until an impartial jury could be selected. On October 14th, Judge Conlin rejected defense motions to dismiss the case or suppress any evidence obtained, ruling Collins's arrest had been on the reasonable grounds that he had committed a felony. In November, in an effort to determine the most effective defense strategy, Richard Ryan persuaded Collins to undergo a private and independent polygraph test. Prosecutor William F. Delhay agreed to a proviso that the test be conducted off the record and its results remained confidential. 3 weeks after the examination at a meeting with the family in Judge Conlin's chambers, Ryan summarized its tentative conclusions and suggested a diminished capacity plea for an insanity defense. Mrs. Collins, incensed at the implication, immediately dismissed Ryan from the case. In January of 1970, Neil Fink and Joseph Louisel, partners at one of Detroit's highest-priced law firms, agreed to take over Collins's defense. Mrs. Collins reportedly remortgaged her home to secure their services. Judge Conlin set a trial date of June 1st. The trial of John Norman Collins for the murder of Karen Sue Bindman began in the Washtenaw County Court building on June 2nd, 1970. He was tried in Ann Arbor before Judge John Conlin. Initial jury selection began on this date and would continue until July 9th. Several motions by the defense counsel throughout the jury selection process that the trial should be moved to a jurisdiction outside of Washtenaw County were rejected by Judge John Conlin, who ruled on June 29th that the 14 members of the jury selected from Ann Arbor by this date and considered satisfactory by both counsels would serve as jurors throughout the trial. Upon recommendation from his lawyers, Collins chose not to testify in his own defense. The prosecutors at Collins's trial, William Delhay and Booker Williams, opted to charge Collins only with the murder of Karen Sue Bindman, with the state contending that she had been murdered by Collins in the basement of the Leak household. In his opening statement to the jury on July 20th, Delhay outlined the prosecution's contention that the evidence to be presented would form a clear pattern indicating that Collins had been in the company of Karen Sue Bindman at the time she was last seen alive by Diane Joan Ghosh and her assistant, that he had taken her to the home of his own uncle, where he had tortured and beaten the girl before strangling her to death at this location, and that he had then discarded her body before attempting to persuade his roommate to provide him with a false alibi. The two primary questions before the jury, Delhay stated, would be the accuracy of the eyewitnesses who would be called to testify and, ultimately, whether the more than 500 hair samples found upon Bindman's panties matched the hair clippings later recovered from the basement of Collins's uncle. Delhay also stated the prosecution's intent to prove that Collins had had sole access to his uncle's home and basement on the afternoon of Bindman's disappearance, and although he had made concerted efforts to remove physical evidence from the crime scene, blood samples recovered from this location were a match for the blood type of the victim. Delhay formally closed his opening statement to the jury by requesting they return a verdict of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. The defense contended that although the murder of Bindman was a vicious, sadistic attack which had degraded her body almost beyond human comprehension. Prosecution's case that Collins was the perpetrator of the crime was a weak one at best. Defense attorneys Neil Fink and Joseph Louisel, in their opening statement, labeled the eyewitness's identification of both Collins and his motorcycle as flawed and unreliable, and stated their intentions to introduce several witnesses who would provide an alibi for their client. In the early afternoon hours, the prosecution contended Karen Sue Bindman had been abducted and murdered. Collins's attorney also alleged these alibi witnesses had been subjected to police harassment. The tests conducted upon the hair samples found upon Bindman's panties were unreliable, and that Collins's uncle, Sergeant David Leake, had refused to divulge the blood types of his family to defense attorneys. Formal witness testimony began on July 20th, 1970. The first two witnesses to testify were Bindman's two roommates, each of whom discussed Bindman's character and her movements on the day of her disappearance. These two witnesses were followed by the individual who had found her body on July 26th and Dr. Craig Barlow, the medical examiner who was called to the crime scene. Barlow testified as to the fact that although Bindman had been deceased for almost 72 hours, her body had only been in the location where she was found for 24 hours before discovery. On the following day, Washtenaw County Sheriff Douglas Harvey testified as to the discovery of Bindman's body, her subsequent autopsy, and his obtaining an updated composite drawing of the suspect with whom Bindman had last been seen alive from Diane Joan Ghosh and her assistant, Patricia Spaulding. Both women had agreed this composite drawing was accurate and only disagreed as to the structure of the suspect's chin. Furthermore, Ghosh had identified a photograph shown to her of Collins as being the man she had seen with Bindman. To expand on their allegations that certain defense witnesses had been subjected to police harassment and that eyewitness accounts had been flawed, defense attorney Joseph Louisel subjected Sheriff Harvey to a 45-minute cross-examination as to his contact with the two eyewitnesses prior to completion of this composite drawing. In this cross-examination, Sheriff Harvey admitted to having driven Mrs. Ghosh and her assistant to East Lansing to view the updated composite drawing of the suspect in Bindman's murder, and that he had shown photographs of various suspects, including Collins, to Ghosh prior to her formally identifying Collins in a lineup. 3 days after both counsels had begun introducing witnesses, Ghosh was called to testify on behalf of the prosecution. In response to questioning from prosecution attorneys, Ghosh described how, on the afternoon of her disappearance, Bindman had informed her she had accepted a lift home from the man waiting outside the wig shop. When asked to formally identify the individual upon whose motorcycle she had observed waiting outside her shop, Ghosh pointed directly at John Norman Collins. Testimony of Ghosh was further supported by Patricia Spaulding, who testified as to having observed Collins for between 3 and 4 minutes as he waited for Bindman to return to his motorcycle. Although she was subjected to intense cross-examination by defense attorney Neil Fink as to the credibility of her testimony, Ghosh remained insistent in her identification of John Norman Collins as being the individual who had waited for Karen Sue Bindman to return to his motorcycle. In an effort to discredit Ghosh's testimony, Fink diverted questioning as to the model of the motorcycle she had seen outside her shop, to which Ghosh conceded her initial belief as to the model being a Honda 350 was inaccurate. In response to questions as to her personal character, Ghosh further conceded she had previously lied under oath on 2 occasions, one instance of which was unrelated to the trial. On July 27th, Arnold Davis testified as to his being in the company of Collins throughout the late afternoon and evening of July 23, 1969, hours after Bindman had last been seen alive. The following day, following a consultation with opposing counsels, Judge John Conlon allowed Davis to testify as to having observed Collins hurriedly removing a laundry box containing women's clothing and jewelry from his apartment and placing the box in the trunk of his car 2 days prior to his arrest. The prosecution had initially intended to question Davis in detail as to each of the contents of this laundry box, upon the grounds that the contents Davis had previously described to investigators may include Bindman's missing cutoff blue jeans, However, Collins's attorneys successfully objected to this motion upon the grounds that Collins was solely on trial for the murder of Karen Sue Beinman, and this testimony would suggest a link to the 6 other victims of the Michigan murders, then linked to the same perpetrator. The prosecution was therefore limited to questioning Davis with regards to whether the contents of this box included women's clothing and jewelry without specifically describing any particular item. Also to testify at the trial on behalf of the prosecution was Marjorie Barnes, who testified on July 30th to having observed Collins leaving his uncle's home carrying a laundry box covered with a blanket on either July 24th or 25th, 1969. In addition, Mrs. Sandra Leake testified to Collins being given a key to the family home in order for him to feed the family's German Shepherd. Mrs. Leake also testified to having cut their children's hair in her basement 2 days prior to embarking on a vacation with her family, and that when they had returned home, she had noticed that several items from her basement had been moved, that she had discovered a wet, soiled cloth containing hair aside a laundry tub, and that other items, including a nearly full bottle of ammonia, were missing. On the same day, the head of the State Police Crime Laboratory, Sergeant Kennard Christensen, testified as to the results of forensic tests conducted in the Leake family basement. The results of these tests confirmed evidence of bloodstains in 4 separate areas. In response to defense questioning, Sergeant Christensen further stated that although partial fingerprints had been discovered in the Leake family basement, no full fingerprints had been discovered in the basement which had not belonged to any Leake family member. On July 31st, the prosecution introduced 2 forensic witnesses to testify regarding the physical evidence indicating the victim had been killed inside the Leake family home. The first witness to testify was the head of the Michigan Health Department's Crime Detective Laboratory, Walter Holtz, who testified as to the human hair clippings found inside Karen Sue Beinman's panties being an exact match to those recovered from the basement of Sergeant David Leake. Although subjected to intense cross-examination by Joseph Louisel as to the reliability of his findings, Holtz remained adamant the color, length, type, and diameter of the hair samples found upon Beinman's panties were a precise match to those found in the Leake family basement. Immediately following the testimony of Walter Holtz, a colleague of his named Curtis Fluker testified that the blood type of the tissue samples recovered from the Leake family basement matched that of Karen Sue Beinman. The 47th and final witness to appear for the prosecution at Collins's trial was a University of California chemistry professor named Dr. Vincent P. Gwynn, who testified on August 5th as to his conclusions that the hair samples retrieved from Beinman's panties bore a remarkable similarity to those retrieved from the Leake household, and that, upon statistical calculations he had begun the previous month, the odds of erroneous matching of the hair samples earlier testified by Walter Holtz were quite low. Upon cross-examination, Dr. Gwynn did agree with defense attorney Neil Fink that a statistical analysis of hair mixtures had never been attempted in a court of law, although he remained firm that his applications had been performed via scientific principles. 5 independent witnesses were called to testify on behalf of the defense as to Collins's whereabouts on the dates Karen Sue Beinman had disappeared and her body had been found. 4 of these witnesses were employees of a motorcycle sales firm which Collins had visited on the afternoon of Beinman's disappearance. Each testified on August 6th. The timing of these 4 witnesses' recollections as to when Collins had actually entered the motorcycle shop varied slightly, although consensus among 3 of these men was that he had entered the premises as they were eating lunch, which they typically had any time between 1 and 2 p.m. Upon cross-examination, the time factor of these witnesses as to when they had actually seen Collins expanded to between noon and 2 p.m. 2 of these employees had signed statements affirming the time Collins had entered their premises was approximately 2 p.m., although one of these witnesses stated he had been repeatedly harassed by an Ann Arbor police sergeant as to the actual time he had seen Collins. On August 8th, Collins's attorneys introduced a renowned neutron analyst named Dr. Robert Jervis in an effort to discredit the earlier testimony of the forensic experts who had testified on behalf of the prosecution. Dr. Jervis testified as to his belief that insufficient chemical samples had existed in the samples retrieved from the basement, which the prosecution scientists had worked with to form their conclusions, and that to form a conclusive neutron activation analysis, at least 10 components in a hair sample must be compared, whereas only 5 components had been used by the prosecution's forensic experts to determine their findings. The forensic experts who had testified on behalf of the prosecution, Dr. Jervis stated, had therefore based their conclusions on insufficient data. Dr. Jervis's conclusions were supported by a private consultant named Oseklis Kirkins and a Massachusetts-based director of forensic research named Samuel Golub. Perkins testified as to his belief that the hair samples retrieved from Bindman's panties were of a different origin than the hair samples retrieved from the leak's basement. Whereas Golub stated that because he had found only one single fiber upon the victim's panties, the likelihood of her undergarments accumulating these hairs from a basement was extremely remote. In rebuttal to the testimony of Dr. Golub, the defense recalled Dr. Walter Holtz on August 12th to testify as to the samples he had himself taken to Dr. Golub for identification. Dr. Holtz affirmed that he had taken 20 magnified photographic slides of samples retrieved from Bindman's panties to Dr. Golub's laboratory for analysis, and that they had contained numerous man-made fibrous materials. On August 13th, both prosecution and defense attorneys delivered their closing arguments to the jury. Prosecuting attorney William Delhay argued first, recounting the evidence the state had presented and Collins's conscious efforts to destroy physical evidence at the Leak household, before telling the jury that their collective application of common sense could only dictate a guilty verdict. Following the state's closing argument, both Neil Fink and Joseph Louisel delivered separate closing arguments on behalf of the defense, describing Collins as a young victim of circumstances and dismissing much of the evidence presented as fuzzy allegations, with Louisel being particularly scornful as to the testimony of Walter Holtz, to whose conclusions he asserted the prosecution hinged its entire case. In a brief final argument on behalf of the prosecution, Booker Williams re-emphasized the physical and circumstantial evidence against Collins before accusing the defense attorneys of attempting to sow doubt in, particularly the forensic evidence presented by the prosecution. In a final address to the jury on August 14th, Judge Conlin informed the panel they had two choices in the verdict they could render: guilty of first-degree murder or not guilty. The jury then retired to consider their verdict and would deliberate for over 27 hours over a period of 3 days, with an additional 5.5 hours devoted to their rereading portions of testimony before announcing they had reached their verdict. On August 19, 1970, John Norman Collins was unanimously found guilty of the first-degree murder of Karen Sue Bindman. He remained impassive upon hearing the jury foreman announce the verdict, although many spectators gasped audibly and his mother and sister left the courtroom in tears. Formal sentencing was scheduled for 8:30 a.m. on August 28. On this date, Collins was formally sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Prior to his passing sentence, Judge Conlin asked Collins if he wished to address the court before mandatory life sentencing was imposed. In response, Collins rose from his chair and made the following speech. I have two things to say. I think they consciously tried to give me a fair trial. The jury did not take its task lightly, but I think things were blown out of proportion. The circumstances surrounding this case prevented me from getting a fair trial. It was a travesty of justice that took place in this courtroom. I hope someday it will be corrected. Second, I never knew a girl named Karen Sue Bindman. I never had a conversation with her. I never took her to a wig shop. I never took her to my uncle's home. I never took her life. Collins was then informed by Judge Conlin that if the juror's verdict was wrong, the error would be corrected in due course. He was then sentenced to serve a term of life imprisonment with hard labor in solitary confinement at Southern Michigan Prison. Upon receipt of the guilty verdict against their client, Collins's defense attorneys announced their intention to appeal upon the grounds of tainted identification and the change of venue question. The first motion by Collins's attorneys, contending denial of defense motions to move the trial outside of Washtenaw County and the prejudice of prosecution witnesses, was filed with the Michigan Court of Appeals on December 14, 1970. This first appeal was formally rejected on October 24, 1972. Between 1972 and 1976, Collins appealed his murder conviction on 4 further occasions, citing contentions that the Michigan murders had received extensive media publicity in Washtenaw County and that 5 separate motions for change of venue had been submitted by the defense counsel, 2 of which had been filed throughout the actual jury selection process, upon the grounds of pretrial publicity minimizing any chance of obtaining an unbiased jury in Washtenaw County. Each motion filed had been reserved or, in the final instance, denied. His lawyers further argued that at an evidentiary hearing in April of 1970, shortly before jury selection had begun, Collins's indictment for the California murder of Roxy Ann Phillips had likewise received extensive media coverage in Washtenaw County, further reducing the chances of potential jurors being unbiased. Moreover, a psychologist retained by the defense had testified as such on April 20th, 1970. The psychologist had been adamant that Collins's trial should be held outside of Washtenaw County, and this motion had likewise been reserved. Furthermore, Collins's lawyers argued issues such as the admissibility of testimony relating to the microscopic analysis of hair samples presented at his trial and the denial of defense motions to suppress prosecution witnesses testifying against their client. In each appeal instance, Collins's conviction was upheld, with successive appellate judges of the Supreme Court announcing in October of 1974 their refusal to review his conviction, and the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit announcing their own satisfaction with the earlier findings of the district court. Each ruling stated no evidence existed to suggest extensive publicity had interfered with pretrial or trial proceedings, and that police had not broken any protocol in showing 2 eyewitnesses photographs of Collins prior to his arrest and their being asked to identify him in a police lineup. At his 1972 appeal hearing, Collins's lawyers did succeed in securing the partial striking of the testimony of Dr. Vincent P. Gwynn, the final prosecution witness at his trial, who had testified as to the odds of erroneous matching of the hairs found upon Karen Beinman's panties to those in the Leak family basement being more than 1,000,000 to 1. This appeal motion was partly upheld upon the basis that Dr. Gwynn's testimony relating to probabilities was based upon the statistical probability of another prosecution expert, and therefore this part of his testimony was impermissible. Nonetheless, the 3 appellate judges at this appeal hearing concluded thus, in our view, improperly admitted testimony that is merely corroborative of properly admitted evidence is not the basis for holding the error reversible. At the time of his 1970 conviction, a grand jury indictment against Collins remained outstanding in relation to the June 1969 murder of Roxy Ann Phillips in Monterey County, California. The physical and circumstantial evidence linking Collins to this particular murder was stronger than any of the 6 outstanding murders then linked to him in Michigan, and authorities in Monterey did file several motions to extradite Collins to California to stand trial for Phillips's murder in 1970 and 1971. These motions were repeatedly contested by Collins's attorney, Neil Fink, who opposed and successfully delayed his client's extradition upon the grounds of due process. The state of California postponed their requests to extradite Collins to face charges relating to Phillips's murder in June of 1971, citing Collins's then ongoing appeals against his conviction in the state of Michigan as the cause, and their likely resubmittal should any of his Michigan appeals be successful. Just 6 months later, in January of 1972, Monterey County District Attorney William Curtis formally announced via a spokesman the intention of California authorities to waive all extradition proceedings against Collins for Phillips's murder. This spokesman indicated the reasoning being that, as Collins had already received a life sentence in Michigan, the case therefore was undeserving of priority attention by California authorities, in part due to the fact that Collins would be returned to Michigan to serve his sentence if convicted. At the time of the announcement of this decision, preliminary legal maneuvers between Michigan and California authorities had been ongoing to extradite Collins to Monterey County to face trial for Phillips's murder. Although he was never tried for the murders of Flazar, Shell, Skelton, Basum, Colomb, or Phillips, physical and circumstantial evidence exists in each case indicating that Collins had indeed committed these murders. For example, in the case of Mary Flazar, as I mentioned previously, investigators discovered that at the time of her disappearance, Collins had worked part time in the Eastern Michigan University Administration Unit and that his office had been located directly opposite the hallway from the office where Flazar had herself worked. One of the personal items missing from Flazar's body was an Expo 67 Canadian silver dollar she is known to have worn around her neck. This item was discovered in Collins's dresser when police conducted a search of his room. When confronted with this finding, Collins reportedly denied any knowledge of the existence of this item and insisted it had never been in his room. He had apparently neglected to dispose of this item, as he had the personal possessions of other victims 2 days prior to his arrest. In the case of Joan Elspeth Schell, 2 separate witness accounts had placed the victim both entering a car with 3 men on the night of her disappearance and walking alone in the company of a man believed to be John Collins later that evening. One of the men in the car Schell had entered was Collins's roommate, Arnold Davis, who later informed police the girl had indeed entered the car he had been driving, but that Collins insisted he give Schell the lift she was seeking to Ann Arbor in his own car. Collins and Schell had departed from Davis's car together, and Davis had not seen his roommate for almost 3 hours before Collins had returned to their apartment by himself, referring to Schell as a bitch and claiming he had dropped her off in Ann Arbor after being unable to obtain the sexual encounter he had hoped to achieve with her. As he had explained this to Davis, Collins had been carrying a red handbag which he claimed Schell had left in his car. He had further informed his roommate he had agreed to drive Schell from Ann Arbor to Ypsilanti the following day. Davis informed police he had long suspected Collins had murdered Schell, but had been too afraid to report his suspicions. Although Collins had claimed to police that he had been with his mother in the Detroit suburb of Centerline on the weekend of Schell's disappearance, police had never sought to verify his alibi. The circumstantial evidence linking Collins to Schell's abduction and murder was stronger than that of any other Michigan victim linked to him, and police would formally announce this fact within days of his arrest. Nonetheless, the decision of the prosecution at his 1970 trial was to try Collins solely for the murder of Karen Sue Beinman. Arnold Davis also informed police Collins had been in the company of victim Alice Colomb on the evening of her disappearance. According to Davis, he had heard Collins and Colomb arguing behind closed doors before Colomb had run out of the apartment, with Collins chasing after her. Collins had returned to their shared apartment shortly thereafter and asked Davis to hide a knife for him. Davis had reported this incident to police and later handed them the knife Collins had allegedly asked him to hide. Investigators determined the knife was consistent with the weapon used to stab Colomb. When Colomb's body was found, a distinctive boot print on her skirt was found to be a perfect match to a boot Collins had owned, and although Collins had evidently cleaned his car in an effort to destroy evidence prior to his arrest, investigators would find bloodstains in this vehicle and upon a raincoat he owned, which were determined to match Colomb's blood type. Moreover, although the prosecution at Collins's trial had been unable to question Arnold Davis in detail as to the contents of the laundry box he had observed his roommate hastily remove from their apartment and toward his car 2 days prior to his arrest, one of the items he had seen within this laundry box had been a distinctive purple leather shoe which may have belonged to Colomb. In the case of California victim Roxy Ann Phillips, police had discovered that prior to her murder, the victim had told a close friend she had met an Eastern Michigan University student named John who owned a silver Oldsmobile Cutlass and several motorcycles. Her nude, strangled body was found discarded in a patch of poison oak on July 13th, with the distinctive red and white floral pattern belt from her culotte dress knotted around her neck. Following Collins's arrest, a section of a red and white belt bearing the same distinctive floral pattern was found in the trailer he and Manuel had towed to Salinas on June 21st. Moreover, a sweater found in Collins's closet was found to contain 22 pubic hairs, which had not originated from Collins or any of the 7 Michigan victims. At the request of Michigan authorities, Phillips's body was exhumed in Oregon in order that pubic hair samples could be obtained from her for comparison with those found upon Collins's sweater. Pubic hairs upon Collins's sweater proved to be a precise match to those obtained from Phillips's body, and investigators believe they may have transferred from her body to Collins's sweater as she was carried to the location in which her body was discarded. In addition, prior to his returning to Michigan, Collins is known to have visited a California hospital to receive treatment for poison oak anaphylaxis. 3 days prior to Collins's July 30th arrest, in direct breach of a Washtenaw County prosecutor order, two young Ann Arbor detectives had arrived at the Emmett Street apartment Collins shared with his roommate to question him as to the circumstantial evidence then obtained against him. Collins had maintained assertions of his innocence on this occasion and insisted the eyewitnesses' identification of him had been erroneous, although he refused to return to the police station to take a polygraph test. No search warrant had been sought prior to Collins being questioned on this date, and his apartment would only be searched on July 30th, 2 days after Arnold Davis had observed Collins hurriedly removing a box of women's clothing and jewelry from his apartment. Had this violation of the county's prosecutor's order not taken place, Collins may not have realized how seriously he was considered a suspect at that stage, and thus may not have disposed of the physical evidence which would have assisted in linking him to other killings linked to the Michigan murders. In the years immediately following his conviction, Collins's mother, siblings, and several of his friends remained steadfast in their belief that Collins had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice. While incarcerated at Southern Michigan Prison, he received regular visits from family and friends. Collins's mother, Loretta, and his two siblings, Jerry and Gail, refused to speak with Sergeant David Leake and his wife Sandra following their testimony against Collins at his trial. Despite the evident distress of Sandra Leake throughout her testimony, during which she had testified that Collins had been as close to her as her own sons, and that she had remained in an uncomposed state since his arrest, Collins's family remained steadfast in their resolve to avoid contact with the Leakes. For several years following his incarceration, Collins refused to grant interviews to the media, but 6 years after his conviction, Collins formally requested a personal interview with reporters from the Ann Arbor News. In this interview, Collins vehemently denied his guilt in any of the Michigan murders. He asserted that key evidence attesting to his innocence had been suppressed by the prosecution team at his 1970 trial, that the jury had been biased, and scientific testimony related to blood and hair comparisons had been invalid. In October of 1977, Collins was transferred from Southern Michigan Prison to Marquette Branch Prison, a more secure facility, due to his repeated dealing in contraband drugs and his conspiring with a fellow inmate to escape. Collins was unable to participate in the actual escape due to sustaining a broken foot. Another escape attempt at Marquette Branch Prison via a tunnel with 6 fellow inmates was thwarted on January 31st, 1979, and Collins and his co-conspirators were transferred to a more secure cell block. In 1980, Collins legally changed his surname to that of his biological father, Chapman. The following year, he formally requested transfer to a Canadian prison in the belief this would facilitate his prospects of eventual release. Chapman holds dual citizenship and under Canadian law would then have been eligible for parole after serving just 9 years in Canada. His application was granted, then reversed in the wake of public outrage. Despite repeatedly challenging the overturning of the 1981 decision to transfer him to a Canadian prison, a federal appellate court ruled in May of 1988 that Chapman should remain incarcerated at Marquette Branch Prison. In September of 1988, Chapman agreed to participate in a live interview conducted by the WXYZ TV talk show Kelly and Company to discuss his conviction. For security reasons, this proposed live interview was canceled, although Chapman agreed to submit to a filmed interview. In this interview, he again denied culpability for any of the Michigan murders and insisted the prosecution case against him was flawed. Chapman was transferred to the Ionia Correctional Facility in August of 1990. Throughout his earlier incarceration at Southern Michigan Prison and Marquette Branch Prison, He had earned a reputation as a troublesome inmate who repeatedly flouted prison rules, was known to deal in contraband goods, and who had served several periods of isolation for various breaches of prison rules. He would later be returned to Marquette Branch Prison. On July 11, 2005, a 62-year-old former nurse named Gary Earl Leiterman was charged with the murder of Jane Mixer, who was once considered the possible third chronological victim of the Michigan murderer, although the modus operandi of her murder was significantly different than that of the Michigan murders. Leiterman had lived 20 miles from the University of Michigan at the time of Mixer's murder and had never been considered a suspect in any of the Michigan murders. After the case was reopened in 2001, advancements in DNA analysis identified Leiterman's DNA on Mixer's pantyhose and partial matches to his DNA on both the bloody towel placed beneath her head and the nylon stocking used to garrote her. He was convicted on July 22nd and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. His conviction was upheld by the Michigan Court of Appeals in 2007. Chapman is currently serving his life sentence at the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility. He maintains frequent correspondence with individuals, particularly women, who write to him, and continues to maintain his innocence of the murder of Karen Sue Beinman, as well as other murders linked to the Michigan murderer, despite having refused a 1977 offer to submit to a further public polygraph test. So, what do you guys think? Is it at all possible that the conviction of John Michael Collins slash Chapman was wrong? To me, it seems like although the prosecution in the case did have a number of missteps and that some of the evidence was only as substantial as forensic technology of the time allowed, if a lot of those missteps had not occurred, that would have only resulted in him being convicted for even more of the murders as opposed to just one of them. In my opinion, it is only reasonable that the defense called into question the validity of some of the evidence because that's their job as defense attorneys to cast doubt on those kinds of things because they didn't have to outright prove that the evidence was actually not valid, but that there were reasons to doubt its validity. I think that there was a startling amount of evidence, if even circumstantial in some instances, that linked him to the murders, including the one he was actually convicted for. It says a lot that the prosecution obviously felt so strongly about his guilt in the other murders that they seemingly did not even attempt to bring anyone else to trial in those cases. I hope you learned a little something today, even if it was a bit gruesome, about Michigan's history. I wanted to cover this topic because I haven't seen a major documentary or docu-series covering this topic, these Michigan murders, the Ypsilanti Ripper. There was supposed to be a movie in the 70s based heavily on these murders, and it was never released, and we will probably never see it in our lifetime. All right, everyone. Thank you for stopping by. I do appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. Bye now.